is just to run through what I think are the biggest myths on the economy being put forward by those who want us to leave the EU. Now, myth number one is they make this point that only a small number of businesses actually trade with the EU, and so it's not really fair on everybody else. I think that is a myth, because basically there are 3 million jobs in our country that are dependent in some way on trade with the single market. Now, I don't argue all those jobs would go, but if we restrict our trade with the single market, clearly they're going to be affected. But I think there's a deeper truth about this particular myth, which is this. There are many, many businesses in our country that are part of the supply chain for those that do trade with the single market. Take, for instance, our car industry. Hugely successful over the last decade. 150,000 people working in our car industry, but actually 300,000 people who are in the supply chain and working with our car industry. So I think this is a complete myth, the idea that only a little bit of business would be affected if we left the EU. It would have a big impact on our economy. That is now being backed up by the OECD, by the IMF, by the Bank of England, by almost every senior economist that looks at it. So I think that is myth number one. Myth number two is somehow that if we weren't in the EU, we could sort of tear up the rule book and have a bonfire of regulations. I think this is a myth in a number of ways. First of all, any business that wants to go on trading with the EU, even if we're outside it, has to meet every single rule and regulation of the single market, and without having any say over what those rules are. Now, that's not a recovery of sovereignty. That is actually losing sovereignty. So I think that is a very, very weak argument. And it's even weaker when you ask people who want to leave the EU, well, which are the actual regulations that you would like us to get out of? Because the truth is, in almost every international survey, Britain comes out as actually a relatively lightly regulated and well-regulated economy. And we're not hearing from those who want to leave a whole list of regulations that they want to get out of. Even in the area of social regulations, Britain has actually chosen on things like holiday pay, maternity pay, actually to do more than the minimum set out by the European Union. So I think that is a total myth. Myth number three, and this is a really important one, is that the EU needs us much more than we need them. So were we to leave, they would give us an absolutely tremendous trade deal or access deal. I wish this was the case, but it absolutely isn't the case, and the figures are very clear. 44% of what we export goes to the European Union. 8% of what the European exports goes to us. So you don't have to be a genius in negotiation to know that the process of negotiating, wanting to leave the EU and then get a good access deal back again, we would need them to agree much more than they would need us to agree. And it's worth thinking as well about this, about another point. We may have a deficit in the sale of goods when it comes to the EU, but we have a very large surplus when it comes to services. And one of the things I think we should fear is that, of course, if we left the EU, they might offer us a deal on goods, but it might take a very long time before they offered a deal on services. And you could almost imagine the thrill and excitement of service businesses in Italy and France and Germany and elsewhere saying, OK, let's cut a deal with Britain on trade in goods, but hold back the trade in services so we can fill all of those insurance and banking and other service industries at which Britain is so good. So I think that is a particularly pervasive and a particularly dangerous myth. Myth number four, having made the argument that somehow they need us more than we need them, myth number four is that there's some great automatic status you could find, like Norway, like Switzerland, like Canada, that gives you access to the single market on the basis that we have it now. And here the Leave campaign have dotted around quite a bit. They started with Norway, because Norway does have an access deal to the single market, but of course Norway pays into the EU as much per capita as we do, and it still has the free movement of people from other EU nations into Norway. But of course the Norwegians have absolutely no say over the rules of the single market. So that is actually a poor status To swap our status today, where we have a total say over all those rules and regulations and full voting powers and voting rights, to swap that for not having a say would be an absolute step backwards. Switzerland's deal doesn't cover services. That would be hopeless for our economy. So then the people wanting to leave jumped onto the idea of the Canada Free Trade Deal. Now, I'm a massive fan of the Canada Free Trade Deal. I've been pushing it very hard. It's very good for Canada. It would be very bad for Britain. First of all, 7 years of negotiation and it still isn't in place. So imagine for Britain being stuck for 7 years trying to negotiate a trade deal with a market where 44% of our trade goes, and which is only 20 miles off our coast. But even if you imagine it was done more quickly, the Canada trade deal doesn't include all services. It does still include a number of tariffs. It has quotas on things like beef, which is a vital export for our farmers. So again, it's not a good deal for Britain. So I think that is a myth, that there's some thing ready for us to pluck off the shelf. The Leave campaign have started talking about this sort of mythical free trade zone that includes places like Macedonia and Albania. I think the idea of painting Britain as a greater Albania is really, that shows you are losing the argument. And even the Albanian Prime Minister came out and said he thought that was a bad idea.